Hello, everyone. Welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host, Liam, aka Himbar, and today I wanted to talk about something I don't spend too much time talking about on my channel directly. If you pay attention to my weekly updates or random videos I make, I'll mention stuff like this, but I really like medieval works. You could probably go so far as to say I'm a medievalist. Um, I don't really give my label, wow, that label to myself. Um, but it is something I like to study. This has largely been on my own, though, as of this point. But every once in a while, basically every few months, I want to read a medieval source, and preferably, I'd like to read it in English, and I mean in the original. So there's some things where I haven't, right? Like I read The Song of Roland this year, and I didn't read that in Old French, or at least not the whole thing in Old French. I read very little bit in Old French, um, because I don't speak, or I can't read Old French very well. But I do like parsing English, be it Middle English or Old English. And we're speaking of early Middle Ages, it's Old English. We're speaking of the High Middle Ages, it's Middle English. And so, like, when you have the King Arthur stuff, it's Middle English. And when you have like Beowulf, that's Old English. So I like Beowulf. I love Beowulf. I read Piers Plowman this year. I read Lamort d'Arthur. I read The Green Knight, not Sir Gawain the Green Knight. I already read that, though I reread it again this year. And I read William and the Werewolf and Sir Gawain and the Carl of Carlisle, stuff like that. But I want to talk about King Horn today because this is the most recent one I read. And this is the oldest romance in Middle English. It's from the 13th century. All right, the story is pretty straightforward. I believe it's only 1,500 lines, and it is about Horn, who lives in Sudena. We're not really sure what that is. Maybe it's the South Danes, as in Beowulf. But whatever it is, the Saracens come. Saracens are interesting in the story because they're essentially described more like Vikings. But in the 13th century, the Vikings aren't really a thing anymore. But Saracens are, right? And so Saracens come, even though they're described as Vikings essentially, and they kill Horn's father, and his mom goes and lives in a cave. And so he flees, or actually, he's let go by the emir because Horn is just so beautiful. And so he goes with his friends, his retainers, and he ends up in an island called Westernesse. And basically, I mean, the shortest way to say it is eventually he goes back to Sardina and he kills the Saracens and he becomes king and he gets the girl. Essentially, that's the story. It has a lot more complexity to it. For example, one of his retainers stabs him in the back, not literally, but keeps on trying to get the king of Westernesse against Horn. For example, the woman he is betrothed to ends up getting married to another man, and in a very much like a Odysseus returning to Ithaca situation, he comes in disguise and he ends up killing everyone at the wedding feast so he can marry this betrothed Rymenhild. And he there's like scenes of him going to exile and fighting with these Irish knights and so on and so forth. But it's very much a romance, if you can understand that. If you want a better synopsis, just go read the Wikipedia article. But it very much is a romance, and it has those themes of betrayal and it often follows someone of royalty of a sort, right? The Will and the Werewolf was basically the exact same, right? Where it's someone coming into their rightful heritage. And so there's interesting stuff you can look at. Of course, it has all the themes of chivalry as well, right? So, but one thing I like about reading this stuff is I prefer to read it when it is written in English. I prefer to read it in English. So William the Werewolf, for example, I couldn't find it in Middle English, but I could find King Horn. Now, apparently, King Horn is derived from Romance of Horn, I think, which is Romance of Horn, which is an Anglo-Norman romance. Anglo-Norman being like the dialect of French, essentially spoken in England after the Norman conquest. And so, but this is in English. And so it's largely you can follow it pretty easily, I feel like. 13th century, it's a little early. a modern English speaker would probably do better to read some 14th century Middle English before going to something like this, maybe. Like Chaucer would be a lot easier to understand, I'd say, but still, this is not too hard. But I did want to go over just some of the lines real quick I found pretty interesting. So in 161 is where we go over that Christ given him his blessing, King of Westernesse. So Westernesse here is where Tolkien got his term for Westernesse. Sorry about the crying baby in the background. He is with his mother actually, but and I should specify also that this is available online to read in Middle English and also available online to read and translated. So I will link both of those down below. Though I believe someone like Kevin Crossley Holland did do a translation. I think you can buy somewhere. I've read his version of Beowulf. Well, I've read several versions of Beowulf, but I have read his. So, I mean, he's done other things, of course. But Westernesse, of course, the S ending is more of like fictional land, right? So I think Elveness is another term Tolkien uses, not as much as Westernesse. But Westernesse is Numenor, right? And Elveness is just all elves collectively, kind of. But the most popular answer besides this Westernesse in Tolkien's work is Leoness, right? That Arthurian land that is, of course, not real. And then we have another line, let's see, that I found interesting. We have 327, I think. Hennes du go thu fula theof, nu wirst du me nevra more leof. Which I just thought was interesting because it sounds funny. Hennes du go thu fula theof, which means hence thou go, thou foul thief. So and hence thou go. Yeah, I just thought that was interesting, basically, because it's very easy to read as modern English. If you just read it, it says hennes, right? But hence, you can tell, right? From here, go thou, right? You foul thief. So I don't know. It's nice to be able to see things that are recognizable. But another thing that might not be as recognizable, unless you know the Old English, maybe, is in lines 339. Lefty mean oha, I think oha. Yeah, oha, sorry that, which means own here, but lefty, which does not mean left-handed, someone who's left-handed. It means lady. And so it's just interesting to me because the F is still in there. Something lady and lord come from Old English words that mean bread, like keeper type of thing. So like bread guardian. So like chlaverd is the Old English word for lord. Chlaford, right? So chlaf is loaf. And so it's cool to see the loaf part is still in lady in the 13th century Kinghorn lefty, right? Which is cool, like I said, because normally you don't see that F, obviously, in our modern word, lady. So, and then there's a scene in 696 where there is a magical act, it seems like, and his swear forth leda, which is, this note says, this bearing of the sword is a magical act accompanying an oath, which I guess makes sense that you pull forth your sword and say an oath, right? And then Hall, who's one of the guys who's worked on this manuscript, says the practice was of the highest antiquity among all northern nations. So you'll see this in other stories as well too. And then there's a section at line 800, which is something the scholars disagree with. It says, "Tak him thine glove," which take him thine glove. And this is something they're not sure what it means. It seems like it might have something to do with like troth, basically, like when you go a wooing, is what this says. So yeah, it seems to be talking about like courtship. And then there's 1060 where it says, let's see, was it 1060? Yeah, I think so. Oh, it's 1062, looks like. So it's en latis mucha deola, quath horn, so Christ meoreda, we shula chaunja weda. So, and that is good, basically. And then saith horn, so Christ counsels me, commands me. Read is actually related to our word like read, like read a book. But read as counsel. You'll see it sometimes. I think Wiccans use the word read in counsel sense still. We shall change weed. And weed here is again something I've only encountered as an archaism in modern English, but that means clothes, your weeds, right? Your weed is your clothes. We're going to change our outfits, right? We're going in disguise. So that's another one. And then just one more. Last one I thought was interesting because this is a relation to Beowulf, is lines 1128, which says, this is to mewer du wenda thu yeth us with the firsta, the beggars Beowulf hersta. So it's they're getting sorry, the beggars are very thirsty. Is that of thirsta, and you give us the first. So you give us first. You come to me where you wend. Then you give to us the first. The beggars are very thirsty. Of thirsta, right? Beowulf thirsta. And this is just a kind of, this happens in Beowulf, I believe, as well. It says here that ancient Germanic custom required the lady or the daughter of the house bear a drinking horn or cup around the guests assembled at the greater feast, such as Wealhtheow and Beowulf, right? So that was cool. Something you can see because it feels more like high medieval romance, but you can still see, especially some earlier stuff too, that it still retains this Germanic side of things. Right? It's changed, right? Society has changed at this point. But you can still see it's the same, besides the fact that the language is still the same language, even though that's been modified as well. Middle English is a lot easier to read than Old English, for example, at least you're a modern English reader. But some other things I noticed, for example, are, I just thought it was funny, duda, which means is a version of did. It just looks like dude, and so I thought that was funny. Off in the whole poem, essentially, you'll see she sometimes, which is she, but you'll also, for the most part, see heo, which is the old version of she. If Old English has all these verbs that start with this H, or these pronouns that starts with this H, and they mean like she and they and stuff like that, and it's like really confusing. And he, obviously, it starts with an H still, and so we take she from Old Norse and they from Old Norse as well, because that helps us differentiate all these pronouns, especially as we stop dropping certain sounds in Middle English. But it's cool seeing here that heo is she, right? You'll see a lot of these sentences of heo, blah blah blah, like I did, she did this, or I did this for her, right? So, and then they still have he as well, though, for they. And so, like, if you know those pronouns, this will help you understand this. But again, like I said, this is why maybe some later Middle English stuff would be easier for people. But I like this one. It was cool to be able to read because of the Westernesse thing in particular. Made me want to read it to get an idea of where something Tolkien had read, right? They use other, for example, as before and as or. In some cases, they use hit still for it. It used to have an H on the front of it. And then they use rape, actually, to mean an archaic meaning of rape. On 558, so I should have gone over this one a minute ago, but rape. Let's see, where's the example? Forthi me stondeth the morapa. So forthi, for you, me stondeth the morapa. So I'll make the greater haste, basically. So rapa, rape, right, in this case. Often, if you read an older text, it means to carry off quickly, or in this case, it just means to make haste, right? To go quickly, make rape, right? And for example, you can see this actually in Titian's The Rape of Europa, which is the abduction of Europa. I imagine this meaning has become something, well, what it means today, but the idea is that you would carry them off and then you would sexually abuse them. Was probably the idea, right? But here again, it's still still means just haste. And so there's some words I also learned a little bit, like unorn, which means ugly, old, worn out. Tena, which means anger or pain. It's hard to corroborate this one with any modern word. And lina, with quiet. Again, I couldn't really corroborate that one. And then Sklavina, which is a pilgrim's robe, which I have found. And then Colmy, which seems to mean dirty, maybe. And then Hawk, which I thought was cool because, I have Liam's Leapians. I could have Hall's Hawk because Hawk means a nook or a corner, just like we have Nicole's Bookish Nook or something because the alliteration there. And then Colin's Corner because of the alliteration, stuff like that. So Hall's Hawk, Halk, Hawk means corner or nook. So, and that's another thing I like about reading this stuff is that you can find these new words. I like archaisms, and so that's where I find some of them is just by reading stories like this. So, anyways, that's King Horn. It's a very interesting romance. The baby is cranky because you have not read it, so you should go read it again. I'll link the 2 free versions down below, the Middle English if you want to look at that, or if you want to read it that way, and then the Modern English translation. But it's Middle English, guys. It's pretty close. You should just try. So, anyways, Liam from Liam's Lyceum. I'll catch you next time.